Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Hi, and welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast, hosted by Hema Lomax and me, Lisa Fine. We are sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights and produced by Tom Fox and the Compliance Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with Jane Norberg, who is a partner at Arnold Porter. Before joining Arnold Porter, Jane was the Chief of Staff of the Office of the Whistleblower at the SEC and was one of the people who built that office into what it is today, both as the chief and before that, deputy chief. So I was thrilled, and thank you so much for coming to speak with me to talk about whistleblowers, particularly in light of the Department of Justice's new program to compensate whistleblowers who report, and I just quoted it, quote, significant corporate or financial misconduct of which the DOJ is not aware or was not aware. So Jane, thank you so much for being here. And before we talk about that, how did you get into compliance and how did you get to the SEC Office of the Whistleblower?
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to be here to talk about all things compliance. But it's an interesting question because I view my career path into compliance and the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower as what I always call the long and winding road. I was a Gen college student. My brothers and I were the first in our family to go to college, and I always wanted to do something exciting with my life that would allow me to travel. And I got that opportunity in spades when I became a special agent with the Secret Service right out of college. And that job definitely taught me crisis management, thinking on your feet, all types of things that you need in the world of compliance. And so at the tail end of my career as a Secret Service agent, I went to law school. And when I got out of law school, I worked at a big New York City firm in the executive compensation group, which certainly had some compliance aspects to it. When my family relocated to DC, I was lucky enough to get the deputy chief job at the SEC in the Office of the Whistleblower right when that program was being stood up. And so as part of standing up that office, I will say I learned a lot about budgets, personnel, policies, procedures, controls, in addition to running a very public-facing office and program that was under what felt a little bit like a microscope. And so it was an amazing opportunity, one that I actually truly loved. And now at Arnold Porter, I bring sort of all of those past experiences that I had to bear. And I help companies with tricky whistleblower situations, including doing internal investigations, SEC defense work, retaliation claims. And then I also help compliance teams with policies, procedures, and controls and training.
All of the things that we really, really need to know. And those things must still be fascinating, especially because you're seeing them from so many different sides, whether it's somebody who is a whistleblower with these very legitimate concerns and companies are trying to do different things versus other things. So I think that just must be so interesting now to be seeing this on so many different sides. And I guess one of those sides, for those of us who aren't as involved in the area, can you talk a little bit about the whistleblower program at the SEC and then the Department of Justice program? There's so many similarities, differences. Can you give a little bit of the lay of the land?
Yeah, absolutely. The SEC's whistleblower program offers three main components. There's confidentiality protections, anti-retaliation protections, and then the monetary awards. And each of those three components are intended to incentivize an individual to report possible violations of the securities laws to the SEC. And that SEC has an incredibly successful program. They've paid, I think now, almost $2 billion in awards to whistleblowers, including just a day or two ago, they paid $39 million to one whistleblower. And I will say from my time there, I mean, it really is almost like a force multiplier for the enforcement division because they're getting tips from whistleblowers that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten or might get tipped off to wrongdoing that they wouldn't have known before. And many times whistleblowers come in with information and documents that really put the investigation further down the path than it would have had the SEC learned about it just through perhaps like a surveillance opportunity. And and I should say the SEC receives tips from all over the world and all over the United States. And so it's a really impactful program for them. And so the DOJ program, when it was announced by Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco several months ago, she had cited to the SEC's program as something that they were looking to perhaps model. They're going to have to be a little bit different. And all we have right now are the outlines of what the Department of Justice said the program was going to be like. I'd say the main way that they're going to be alike is that they're going to offer money, this monetary incentive to report wrongdoing. And I think that's something that the government as a whole has seized onto after seeing how impactful the SEC's whistleblower program is. There, you see these pop-up ones. There's the Department of Justice one, which I'll give a little bit more detail about in a minute, but there's also anti-money laundering whistleblower programs. And in the automotive industry, they also pay whistleblower awards to report to NHTSA. So you can see sort of these copycat programs to the SEC's program popping up. But this DOJ program, it's intended to fill gaps that other whistleblower award programs don't have. So if someone provides a tip and they can't get paid under the SEC's whistleblower program, but the DOJ is able to bring their own case and get penalties, get money, then they will pay out on that. But if the SEC has paid on it already, then it is something that the DOJ won't double pay. So I would say that's how it's a little bit different. But specifically, the DOJ said that they are looking for tips related to criminal conduct involving the U.S. financial system, cases outside the SEC jurisdiction, such as FCPA violations by non-issuers or violations of the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, and domestic corruption cases were just a couple of the ones that were specifically mentioned when that program was announced. We're still waiting. We're still waiting for the final rules. And so we don't know what those are going to look like. And with all programs, I think the devil's in the detail when those rules come out.
That actually just into my next question about it, which is, I think we had initially thought, and when you and I originally talked about scheduling this, we were thinking about doing it after these guidelines came out. And we decided to speak now. Hopefully, once this does change, and depending on what happens, then we will talk again. But why do you think that it is a delay?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when it was announced, I think Dag Monaco said 90 days. She said there was a sprint to put this program in place in 90 days. We're past 90 days. And we've heard nothing. So my guess is they're still trying to figure it out. My guess is that there's a lot more that goes into this than they actually truly thought about. A couple of examples that I can think of when I was at the SEC would be, do they have staff for a dedicated whistleblower office? I mean, that was critical in the SEC's program, because if you don't have people who are just truly dedicated to administering that program, there are a lot of tips that come in. You just want to have a staff that is able to sort through those tips, to deal with whistleblowers, to just handle the program. Like their whole job is handling the program. Because I think when you find that there isn't a dedicated office, things fall through the cracks. People have their own day jobs to do, and it becomes like a side project. And I think if the DOJ wants to truly have a successful program, they're going to need to have the personnel and standing up a dedicated office. And then that goes into the structure, right? Who do they report to? Where on the org chart are they? And then I would also say I don't know exactly where the money's going to come from to pay whistleblowers. Under the SEC's program, there's a pot of money that was put in place by Congress that replenishes automatically when it falls below a certain threshold. And it is funded from fines from wrongdoers. And I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work from the DOJ perspective. I think that they had said that they weren't going to pay out an award until after certain other individuals got paid. And it'll be very interesting to see how that's going to work. And there's the old saying, Lisa, that if you build it, they will come. But if you don't build it right, then they might not actually get the most impact from this program that I think that they're hoping to get.
Especially if people know that they have different or easier avenues, and they may just go to the SEC, not necessarily recognizing the distinction of what it is. Or, I mean, it's rare for whistleblowers to be that. They're raising the concerns, the distinctions of what law that falls under may be lost, and as it should be. If it's a wrongdoing, it's wrongdoing. So that will be interesting. Do you think that any of that has to do with some of the more recent Supreme Court decisions or uncertainty that's coming out because we have an election regardless of results?
I mean, it could be. I'm sure that they're taking a look to make sure that none of the more recent Supreme Court cases could be impacting this. I'm doubtful that they really are. My guess is it's more of the things we just talked about, just sort of trying to figure out what's going to make the most sense. There's a lot to fill in around those guideposts that Lisa Monaco had mentioned. I mean, things like culpability of a whistleblower. What if they're an insider? Or what if the company provides information first, but the person reported internally that information? Are they knocking that whistleblower out? What if they're an officer or director of the company, right? There's so many pieces to think about that I think that's truly what the holdup is. But you hit on something. I mean, look, if there's a change in administration, could this program just be sidelined if in fact it doesn't get up and running? It could, it might, but I think there's probably enough momentum that they'll put it in. I think they're just probably trying to figure out these logistics.
As you said, if they build it, then people will come.
That's right.
But now I want to talk a little bit about the SEC and sort of from a global standpoint. We talked a lot about it from our U.S.-based one. But one of the things that, as people know, is that anyone can report misconduct. And I think the last report that I saw that was that the SEC received tips from over 100 countries outside the U.S. I think the highest ones, were Canada, the U.K. But what are you seeing? What trends, anything interesting that you're seeing, both from when you were there and now as you look at these things, right?
Yeah, so it is a global program. There's no question about that. When I was there, I would say early on, we were very surprised at how many tips were coming in from around the world. I think that has to do with the fact that the U.S. does have this monetary incentive in their program and other countries do not. There might be one or two that do, but for the most part, the U.S. is the only one that has this monetary incentive. And so if there is a U.S. nexus, I think people even from other countries are incentivized to report to the SEC. And I will say from my time at the SEC, those tips could be quite impactful. Sometimes there was an SEC investigation that may have been stalled because, as you can imagine, it's harder to conduct investigations in jurisdictions outside of the U.S. And there's coordination with the local law enforcement authorities. And so when you have a whistleblower who might be on the inside of a company who then reports information to the SEC, it can really just blow an investigation wide open. And I mean, I saw it happen on more than one occasion where that information was very useful. And I will say a lot of the tips from outside the US, not all of them, but many of them are FCPA related, as you can imagine. And so in many FCPA cases, I would say that whistleblower help was very useful to them.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And it's important for them to have ways to reach out. And particularly, I've thought about this a little bit lately, too, when you have the data privacy laws or the other things, even with internal hotlines or reporting, being able to know you have this option, regardless of what data or EU or other things saying you need to go locally first, knowing that if something really goes wrong, you also have a government, even if it's not your government, that you can reach out to, I think is somewhat helpful.
Yeah, and I think the SEC has made it very easy, right? All you have to do is go online and fill out a form. I mean, as long as you have a computer, you can submit a tip under the SEC's whistleblower program. So I think that has made it very easy to become a very global program.
And the thing that you also said about the global program that I thought was really interesting that I'd never thought about but back in the day, not totally age myself, they used to talk about this stereotype of the ambulance chaser lawyers. Now it seems like, given the pot of money that's replenished, and you were saying it made sense after you did that, there are some different attorneys or firms globally, individuals that are trying to suss out wrongdoing, but to actually find the whistleblowers to make these reports, to represent. Can you explain that and also talk from a compliance and ethics program standpoint, what we can do to kind of help ourselves about that?
Yeah, it's a really tough situation. So whenever there's money involved, I think you have people who are reporting information for the very right reason, right? If there's something happening at a company, there's wrongdoing, and it seriously needs to be reported, then it needs to be reported. There are definitely law firms that are dedicated and attorneys that are dedicated to the whistleblower program. Some of them are very good. I mean, I dealt with a lot of them when I was at the SEC. I mean, really smart and thoughtful, and really just trying to bring forward the tips that actually made sense to bring forward, versus not every tip is a good tip. But every now and then you will find, as with every profession, potentially people want to take advantage of the monetary award and try to find loopholes and ways to get their firm representing whistleblower and getting paid. And so sometimes you do see firms like actively looking for whistleblowers in a particular company. And here's the problem and the issue I think that companies deal with is, I think whenever there is a tip that's reported internally, I do think it needs to be taken seriously. I don't think there's any tip that you can look at and just say, oh, we're just not going to deal with that. With that one, I think that's very hard in this day and age where you do have someone who can easily report the same tip to the SEC. Because imagine if it is a good tip, right? If it is a good tip and the SEC picks up on it, or the DOJ or some other authority picks up on it, and they come in and subpoena the company, and if the company's sitting there saying, oh yeah, we had that tip, but that really wasn't a great employee or something like that. And so therefore we didn't take it super seriously. It just looks really bad for the company. It's a lost opportunity for them to potentially have remediated an issue before the government comes in and it gets much, much worse. Now, it's hard, though, I think, to figure out which are the good tips and which are the not so good tips in a company. And I think everyone should be triaged in some manner. The tires should be kicked on every single tip and then documented. So I know I hear a lot of times from companies, we got this tip, it's anonymous though, and we don't have a lot of information. And it's really hard for us to do a thorough investigation. Nowadays, a lot of these hotlines and the software that's being used, if it was reported through a hotline anonymously or through a web form anonymously, a lot of times you can communicate back to the person and they can still remain anonymous, which I would absolutely recommend doing to try to get more information and to also let them know tip's been received. We're taking it seriously. We're going to take a look at this and try to get more information if you can. But sometimes the whistleblower doesn't respond. I've seen that too, right? You reply and they don't respond. And there's nothing more you can do about it. I mean, you can kick the tires based on the information you have. And then I think you just have to document, right? I mean, here's what we did. Here's what we thought about. And here are the steps we took. And then that way you also have that intelligence in case somebody else comes in and reports something similar, then you can connect the dots and take that information and go forward with it.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. Document is my theme. And I remind people sometimes, you don't have to write a memo. You can write an email to someone. You can date and time and show that memorializing. So it's not like everything is huge. I could talk about hotlines and practices pretty much all day, and I'm not going to put anybody through that. But one thing I always think is really helpful is the response to the anonymous person. And sometimes you can kick tires. Sometimes I got one years ago that it's not of the level of what we're talking about in one of my initial days, where somebody is saying, I'm based in Atlanta and overtime's not being given fairly, or wage an hour. That was at the time one of our largest places. What shift? Give us something other than we did. And the person wouldn't respond. While we kept our eye out for it, we also couldn't, from one person out of a couple thousand employees, go and ask everyone everywhere about a situation. It is also proportionality, but in an analog, you can say, look, this is what we did. I think it's important for people not to say, and the other hard part is you might have regular reporters and you have to go through every sentence, no matter how long or how arduous it seems, because it's the crying wolf. I mean, at some point you have to recognize that it's not all going to be that.
Yeah, no, that's right. And there are, just like the SEC got good tips and bad tips, or not so good tips. I don't call them bad tips, but same thing with a company. You're going to have good tips, you're going to have great tips, and you're going to have some that are just might not make so much sense and just are not credible. but you still need to document what was done. And it's still important in my mind to communicate with that person who reported it, because even if it's a not so great tip, ultimately the employment relationship might break down. There might be thoughts of that they've been retaliated against or things like that. And so just making sure that person feels heard and communicated with, and you have a record of all the communications with that person is going to be important later if there is sort of an allegation around retaliation or I've been treated differently or whatever it may be. That's another unfortunate outgrowth sometimes from a whistleblower tip can be the suspicion and concern about whether they're being treated differently now because they provided a tip.
Yeah, absolutely. And people talk. So even if the person doesn't write you back, if they say Lisa Fine or somebody else responded to me directly and asked more questions, if someone else hears them say that or someone who has an issue, it's actually showing to a larger audience than you may think. I think that's why being in contact, even if they don't hear back or look at it, I mean, we can tell that too so I think that part is huge. Yeah,
and I agree with that. And I will say just the flip side of that, if someone has bad experience and reported anonymously, but somehow the company reverse engineered and said, we think you reported this, or it spreads like wildfire through a company, and nothing will kill an internal reporting program at a company worse than people being suspicious of it and whether or not they can trust it.
Yeah, we see that. I mean, the other challenge I think that I've talked to you from a practical standpoint is sometimes somebody will raise a concern, which is a good tip, but they won't necessarily agree with the end of what they think the result was, may not be what the actual result was, or they're like, you're wrong in how you're handling this. And that's also a challenge too. It's not perfect. You can't, because it does take a lot of courage a lot of times for people to reach out. So balancing those sorts of things. But from a reporting standpoint, I would think that when any sort of government entity sees, look, this is the investigation, this is what we took, this is the action we took, unless you really missed the mark, I think generally that's considered pretty trustworthy.
Yeah, absolutely. No question.
I guess that follows up with the statistics I've seen, and I try to find the most recent one I saw was from 80% of whistleblowers report in first. So first, do you think that's accurate? And second, who do you think that when they say that they're reporting to? Is it the hotline? Is it the manager? Is it some combination?
Yeah. So when I was at the SEC, we did gather this stat, and it was based on whistleblowers who provided information to the SEC, and that information was specific, timely, and credible enough for the SEC to do an investigation, bring an enforcement action, and the whistleblower to get paid. So meaning it's those good tips that the SEC got and there was an enforcement action brought. In those instances, when the employee was reporting on the company that they worked at, if they reported that they had reported internally at some point, right? It doesn't have to be first. It could be at the same time they report to the SEC. It could be after. But that they had some communication with someone internally about this issue. That is where that stat comes from. And I will say from my time there, not only just that stat, but also just speaking to whistleblowers, especially early in the program. One of the biggest things I heard was, I told my boss, and I didn't feel like my boss did anything with the information. And that is where I would say is one of the biggest gaps in companies, is with middle management and their training and them understanding, even just basically like, when have I received a tip? Because I think people think about a whistleblower and think, oh, they're coming in and they're raising this big issue and I'm going to know immediately that it's a tip. It is usually not like that at all. It's usually not. It's usually just in a meeting or in the course of a conversation, somebody raises an issue, and just having the manager attuned to, here's our business, here is the business that we're in, and here are some really concrete examples of what could happen. And I think it's really important to make it very specific to your business, because no two businesses are created equal. And and I think giving them real world examples of, here's what you could, for example, hear. And then here's what you do with that information. So it's not only you receive this tip, now what? And a lot of times middle managers, I think, feel like they need to resolve it. Mm-hmm. It's their issue to resolve. And I think many companies don't want and shouldn't want necessarily managers to resolve it on their own. It should go to a central, whatever the triaging mechanism is within in the company, wherever tips go is where that tip should go to be triaged and considered. Because if you think about it from this perspective, that manager, that one manager heard information, and if he or she sits on that information and doesn't report it out, the hotline or someone else could have other information, other tips that they received on a very similar topic, and they're not getting that additional piece of information. And that could make the whole internal investigation. And so I would say middle managers, training them, making sure they understand what a tip is, making sure they understand their obligations and their role in that internal reporting system for that company is critical.
Yeah, I think that one of the most effective ways of doing that type of training is not always modular or other things. You talk to groups of people or managers to cascade and say, you're not supposed to be the expert on all of these things, but you are supposed to have, when some of these things come up to you, and again, they're different from company to company. If you see these are red flags, you need to, if you see this, raise it to someone else. Then you've done your job. You might have to help later. And then you're not owning it anymore. Because sometimes it works better with others. There's also people who feel like they want to protect their people. But I think it's a really important thing and distinct. And I had a feeling you were going to say that it was often managers, because managers, they're trying to do what their job is. And this is not the part of the day they really want. At least most business people are not like, oh, I think this might be something that leads to an investigation. How exciting. Let's get right to it.
I think they want nothing to do with it. Exactly.
When people talk to me, we'll get done with something. They'll be like, I don't want this to come out wrong, but I hope I don't have to see you again soon. Maybe if out and about, but I understand that's but like I said, but if it could be you, that would be, if I have to do this, you're okay. So that's my bar of compliments. Like that. I mean, we talked a lot about all the different things, and we've been talking about global companies most of the time, but what is like a one practical tip that you would give listeners? Our listeners are all different levels of experience about as they're building or trying to maintain a hotline program.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest things is making sure, so I think we touched on a couple of them, so I can give you a couple practical tips. I would say making sure that whatever hotline mechanism you use has the ability, and I think most do now, to talk to that anonymous whistleblower, I'd say is number one. And number two is if someone reports anonymously, truly let them be anonymous. I dealt with companies on both sides now, the SEC and even now in private practice, where someone reported something through a hotline, but what they said identified them, right? So even though they were anonymous, it was sort of clear who was putting in the tip. And I think the worst way to handle that is to show up at that person's door and say, we think you put in this hotline tip, and so let's talk about it. I mean, and I know that is probably a reaction, right, to get information, like you want to get a little more information. But I actually think that's probably the just not a good way to handle it, because that individual imagine thinking you're putting in something anonymously, and then somebody says, oh, I think you're the anonymous person, right? People panic, they get very nervous, and they're like, oh my gosh, I thought I could be anonymous. And so I think it breaks down the employment relationship like we talked about, and people then become very suspicious of retaliation and other concerns. And then the point you made, which is word gets around. So somebody says, I thought this was anonymous, but it's not. I mean, again, people are just not going to trust that internal reporting mechanism. So I would say that's another.
I work for a very remote company, and one of the things, and I think people see this too, so sometimes it's less door, but sometimes, and that I believe you should never do, but one of the hardest challenges when somebody is anonymous and then attaches a bunch of documents that were sent to them.
Yeah.
And you're asking follow-up questions. What I think one of my colleagues does is so well, keeps it as an anonymous conversation, but at some point refers back to the email, because you're asking questions for that, which then if you get in that discussion, it becomes clear that it was, without making it that way or without ever saying, but at least that the person understands that when you're keeping it confidential, because I think that can be a challenge sometimes too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there may come a point where the person doesn't want to necessarily be anonymous anymore. Right. And they may, after conversations, they may build enough trust that they do have a more open conversation. But you're absolutely correct, is that making sure that you're keeping them as confidential as you possibly can is really, I think, critical to that trust in that relationship.
Yeah. And really, that's about the end of the questions I had. If there's anything else you want to share, but I would like to ask you, in your real life time when you're hopefully not thinking or talking about this stuff, what are you doing to either release stress or just escape a little bit? That's been something I've been thinking about for everybody lately.
Yeah, I take walks. I'm a big walker. I started that during COVID, right when everyone couldn't leave their house and go places. I mean, I just started walking, and I find that even in the middle of the day, I need a little break, and I just take a lap or two around the neighborhood, and it feels like just is so nice. I think to get out there and feel the sunshine on my face. Though in DC recently, not so much because it's 100 degrees, but otherwise, it's like, I love that. That's one of my favorite things to do.
Yeah, I like walks a lot too. When you said that about DC, I kept thinking it was so good to be able to do that during COVID now and be able to walk and be outdoors. And then basically our area, we live in the same area. What do they say? Hold my beer? Let's just make it so that all I want to do is stand near air conditioning in a refrigerator. And thank you, Jane. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to catch up, and hopefully you will come back when we can talk about what's actually been put in place, and really do appreciate it. So on behalf of Emma and me and the Compliance Podcast Network, thanks so much, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you so much. I was really happy to talk to you today.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.